Good evening, and thank you very much, Mr. Shields, for that introduction and for the invitation, and for all those who have helped me get here tonight, both remotely as a student at the college, but also for the invitation, for the opportunity to be here. It's a blessing to be in another context. It's a bit of a sort of dysphoria, I think, something like that, to see a new instantiation, sort of, for me, from zero to arriving here and seeing a sort of TAC here in New England. But I think it's a wonderful thing, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. The Noble Do, Aquinas and Debitum Morale. In this lecture, I'm going to be examining the idea of debitum morale as used in the works of Aquinas. This is often translated as moral due, but given the broad possibilities of what the word moral and the word due might mean, I will often use the Latin phrase debitum morale. Our goal here is to understand better the meaning of the term and how it fits into the moral outlook of Thomas Aquinas. I will begin by looking at what I consider to be the most important text regarding this idea in question 80 of the second part of the Summa Theologiae. After that, we will look back at the passage of Aristotle that Aquinas points to as his source for this idea. There will follow a further presentation of a few additional passages from Aquinas, where he uses the idea of debitum morale, and then we will look at a particular virtue where he uses this notion to analyze and explain the virtue. To give a couple of sort of objectives or ideas or what I'm trying to do here before I jump into the text itself. The first is that this idea that Aquinas makes use of is somehow his own. That he is following Aristotle, he's taking an idea, but that he makes it his own, and I believe innovates in a way that is unique to him. And there's something that shows Aquinas' genius and his outlook on the moral life. Second, this idea is intended to be used in understanding a relationship among the virtues. So this is movement to try to group the virtues under the cardinal virtues, and this is an idea which he's using in that context to group virtues with the cardinal virtue of justice in the particular case. Third, that the nature of the moral due is something that makes it noble and above the type of due involved in the virtue of justice. So we'll see that more precisely as we go along. So first, let's look at the primary text, where Aquinas uses this notion of debitum morale in the Summa Theologiae. This text is found in the second part of the second part, as I said, in the section where Aquinas is considering a division of the various virtues related to justice. Question 80 of the Secunda Secundae is entitled, Of the Parts of Justice. This question 80 is one of the very few in the Summa that consist in a single article. The article itself is given the title within the question. So you have a question and a single article. The single article is given the title, Whether the Virtues Annexed to Justice Are Suitably Enumerated. So do we have a suitable set of virtues that are connected with justice? Aquinas and the scholastics in general had inherited a collection of lists of virtues, especially from Cicero, Macrobius, and Aristotle. These lists contain different kinds of elements that could not always be categorized as species or types of the virtue to which they were related. If you look at these texts in someone like Cicero, for instance, you're surprised. Aquinas gives a lot of credit to Cicero and these others, but when you look at the text, they're very short, very concise. There's not a lot of doctrine there. And so the medieval theologians had to work on these ideas and really get to create a doctrine which wasn't really there in at least in Cicero. And obviously, there's a lot more in Aristotle. It was necessary, therefore, to provide an explanation of how they related to the cardinal virtue in order to make these connections, and Aquinas dedicates a question to address the different kinds of parts in his treatment of prudence, fortitude, and temperance. Those are questions 48, 128, and 143, respectively. So of the 6 questions in the Summa, which only have one article, 4 of those deal with the parts of the virtues. So there's something that he sees as sort of singular there, and he attaches on to that as a singular thing where it's worth a question, but there's only one article of the question. For justice, on the other hand, he only dedicates a question to consider a certain type of parts of the virtues, which we're looking at right now, the potential parts. And incidentally, if this weren't singular enough to have only one article, there's no sed contra in this article. So you have a sort of 2 singularities in this single question of the Summa. So the body of the article begins by providing a generic meaning of what makes a potential part of one of the cardinal virtues. He says, 2 points must be observed about the virtues annexed to a principal virtue. The first is that these virtues have something in common with the principal virtue, and the second is that in some respect they fall short of the perfection of that virtue. The first time I'm going to complain about a Latin translation is here, which it's always good to remind you that you need to study your Latin so that you can read Aquinas in Latin. It says, the second is that in some respect they fall short of the perfection of that virtue. It actually says that fall short of the perfecta ratione virtutis. So to fall short of the definition of the virtue, not necessarily of the virtue itself. Although one could argue it's the same thing. I don't think so in this case, but that's something we can discuss in the discussion period. The potential part then, this thing he's talking about, having something in common with the principal virtue, of which it is a part, does not fulfill the perfect notion of the principal virtue. He then moves to apply this general principle to justice and its potential parts, going on in the same text. Accordingly, since justice is of one man to another, as stated above, all the virtues that are directed to another person may, by reason of this common aspect, be annexed to justice. Now, the essential character of justice consists in rendering to another his due. Redatur quod ei debetur. So rendered what is due to the other. According to equality, as stated above. This is the principle of justice, that you're rendering in a certain type of equality. Wherefore, in 2 ways may a virtue directed to another person fall short of the perfection. Again, here, it's perfecta ratione and not perfectionis. First, by falling short of the aspect of equality, and secondly, by falling short of the aspect of due. So in justice, you're going to render to the other person something which is due to them, and you're going to render it in a certain balance of equality. So someone loans you money and you pay them back equally. And we see saying there could be a falling short either in the equality, so somehow I'm not giving the equal amount back in one of these exchanges, or it's not fully due what I'm rendering. It should be noted at this point that the falling short is said to be from the perfect notion of justice, not from the perfection of justice itself, as some of the English translations state, as I said already. It is deficiency from the definition of justice, not necessarily an inferiority or deficiency as regards justice as something more perfect. The remainder of this part of the body speaks of the first set of these virtues, which falls short of attaining the equality that is proper to justice. These include the virtues of religion, piety, and observance. So here, in the case of something like religion, we don't render to God what's equal to his having created us. So it's obligatory, but not in equality. The same with our parents or our country. We can't render to them in equality to what we received. We pass on from there to the second set of potential parts, which falls short on the side of the due, or debitum. Regarding this set, he first lays out a distinction of debitum that allows them to be like the principal virtue, but manifests how they fall away from it. Continuing again in the text, a falling short of the just due may be considered in respect of a twofold due, moral or legal. Wherefore the philosopher assigns a corresponding twofold just. The legal due is that which one is bound to render by reason of a legal obligation. And this legal obligation is debitum legale, legal due, you might say. And this due is chiefly the concern of justice, which is the principal virtue. On the other hand, the moral due, debitum morale, is that to which one is bound in respect of the rectitude of virtue. Here, rectitude of virtue is ex honestate virtutis. This honestas, which is a big idea, which probably means something more like nobility, integrity, or perhaps even authenticity. We're going to see several times this evening. The potential parts of justice, like justice itself, govern our actions with respect to some debitum, a due. In the case of the principal virtue of justice, this is a legal due. But this set of potential parts governs our actions with respect to a different kind of due, namely one that he calls moral, morale. This moral due is due, owed, from a certain nobility or integrity of virtue. He refers, for this idea, to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 8, as the source of the distinction between the legal and moral due, which we will examine below. Aquinas continues to develop the application of the moral due by distinguishing it into 2 degrees and applying that distinction to 2 different sets of potential parts. And since a due implies necessity, I quote, this kind of due has 2 degrees. For one due is so necessary that without it, moral rectitude, and here we have honestas morum, so this honestas appearing again, cannot be ensured. So it's necessary to ensure this moral rectitude. And this has more of the character of due. Moreover, this due may be considered from the point of view of the debtor, and in this way it pertains to this kind of due that a man represent himself to others just as he is, both in word and in deed. Wherefore to justice is annexed truth, whereby, as Tully says, Cicero, present, past, and future things are told without perversion. It may also be considered, I continue, to be considered from the point of view of the person to whom it is due, by comparing the reward he receives with what he has done, sometimes in good things, and then annexed to justice we have gratitude, which consists in recollecting the friendship and kindliness shown by others, and in desiring to pay them back, as Tully says, sometimes in evil things, sometimes in good. The first set of virtues that attend to a moral due still imply a necessity that is essential for the preservation of good morals. So within this second set, right, of the moral due, he's making a distinction. Some are required for the preservation of good morals. Some are only there for the furthering or the greater integrity. Because of this necessity, these have more the notion of debitum or due. This type of necessity can pertain to the person who owes it or to the person to whom it is owed. So we saw what he said. In the case of truth, in some sense, what you owe is that you are in conformity with yourself. So there's an equality with oneself. Whereas in the case of something like gratitude, there's a proportion to the other that has to be preserved. Let's look at the last small section in this passage. So he says this, there is another due that is necessary in the sense that it conduces to the greater rectitude, honestas, although without it, rectitude may be ensured. This due is the concern of liberality, affability, or friendship, or the like, all of which Tully omits in the aforesaid enumeration because there is little of the nature of anything due in them. So we can imagine something like affability or liberality. If in a particular situation there's a lack, we don't automatically violate the integrity of virtue. Although if we lacked it completely, there would be probably something wrong in the fullness of virtue of the person. But if in some particular instance one isn't liberal or generous, it doesn't mean that the person isn't virtuous. So to summarize this text from question 80, Aquinas employs the idea of different types of due to distinguish a set of virtues from the perfect notion of the virtue of justice. He states that the debitum morale arises from the integrity or nobility of virtue, ex honestatis virtutis. Then he makes a distinction from where this moral due is necessary for the preservation of virtue or where it contributes to a greater integrity. In proposing this distinction between the two types of due, Aquinas refers to the 8th book of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. As we move into the consideration of this text of Aristotle, I would like to give a little bit of a historical context, which I believe sheds a lot of light on how this was received by Aquinas. In the first half of the 13th century, scholars had access only to the first 3 books of the Nicomachean Ethics. So if you read, they're talking about the Vetus and the Ethica Vetus, Ethica Nova. These were fragments of the whole of Aristotle's Ethics. So they didn't have the whole work available at the time, up until about the middle of the 13th century. In the 1240s, Aquinas is born in 1225. No. He's born earlier, slightly earlier. A master of Oxford and Bishop of Lincoln, Robert Grosseteste, whose name does mean big head, if you don't follow the Latin or the Italian, produced a complete translation of the Nicomachean Ethics from the Greek original. This translation would have arrived at Paris towards the end of Albert's time there, most likely in 1246 or 1247. So this is the moment, basically, when Aquinas arrives in Paris from, he's a young religious, he makes profession, he tries to get away from Italy. His mother has his brothers stop him, jail him in the tower for about a year, and then he's released and he goes to Paris and starts studying under Albert. So this work of Grosseteste was translated and published along with translations of some of the Greek commentaries, and also included textual annotations of Grosseteste himself. These editorial notes were often of a philological nature and offered explanations of various Greek words or their translations into Latin. So imagine that the text of Aristotle, which we're talking about, wasn't available until a very precise moment, which happens to be about the moment when Aquinas arrives in Paris. And what happens is Albert and Aquinas go to Cologne and study together there. Obviously, Albert is the master. He's founding a school in Cologne, and he takes Thomas with him, partly as student, partly as a teaching assistant. And Albert there, this is the sort of second point I think that's very important to note. Albert there wrote a commentary on the ethics of Aristotle, which was basically, unknown until, well, we knew about it, but it was lost until the 60s or 70s of the previous century. So there's been very little study of this particular commentary of Albert. But the commentary was made with Aquinas as his teaching assistant. So we have a new work in the middle of the 13th century. Aquinas is a sort of young student working with this great master, and they go to Cologne and they spend a year probably working on a very, very thorough commentary of the text. So I believe that this is an important, the importance of this isn't yet grasped in the Thomistic studies, partly because the revelation of this commentary of Albert was sort of forgotten in the post-conciliar period after it was discovered. So if someone wants a doctoral thesis to work on, you're not there yet, but it's something to think about, studying more thoroughly this text of Albert on the Nicomachean Ethics. So let's look at the text of Aristotle, enough history. The 8th book of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, again, which is sort of just arrived in the life of Albert and Aquinas, is dedicated to an analysis of friendship. The passage Aquinas refers to in most English editions is found in chapter 13 of this book, where Aristotle is considering the friendship of utility. I'll read the first part of this text. It seems that just as there are two kinds of things which are just, one unwritten and the other according to law, so there are two kinds of friendship based on usefulness, one ethical and the other legal. Accordingly, accusations arise especially whenever exchanges are made not according to the same type of friendship, and the parties break off their friendship. So, Aristotle sees, we can't go thoroughly into this, but for those of you who haven't thought about this yet, there are three kinds of friendship. He has a much broader view of friendship than we might have. And you have friendship of virtue, or then friendship of excellence, friendship of pleasure, and friendship of utility, which we might think more on the lines of sort of business relationships and this kind of thing. And Aristotle's here talking about this last sort of thing and distinguishes between an ethical, ethike, and legal, nomike type. So he distinguishes himself, what he means by these two types. I quote, "Now legal friendship is formed on specified terms, and it may be purely commercial and carried out immediately, or it may be more liberal with respect to time, but agreed upon as to its terms. The debt in the latter case is clear, not subject to dispute, and the postponement has an element of friendship. And it is in view of this that some states allow no suits, lawsuits that is, or legal cases, concerning those debts, but think that men should accept the consequences regarding exchanges based on trust." Okay, so we have a explicit set of agreed terms by which an exchange is going to take place. So there's an understanding between the two parties about how the exchange is going to unfold, although it may allow for some kind of flexibility. Such agreements, he says, can be immediate from hand to hand, meaning you're in the marketplace, you make a decision about a price, and you complete the sale. Or they can be more free in the sense of allowing a period of time to pay back. So there's a sort of credit situation where you're going to pay back, or you're going to be given some good, or have some kind of account where you then at some point have to pay it back. Aristotle comments that these more flexible forms of exchange sometimes preclude opening a suit against the debtor, and the same will apply all the more in the ethical friendship which he addresses next. Thank you for bearing with me. Getting over a cold, and I'll do my best. Ethical friendship, I quote, "on the other hand, is not formed on specified terms. A gift or any other good is bestowed as to a friend, but the giver expects to receive as much or more as if what he gave were not a gift, but something lent to be used. And if at the end of the exchange he is not as well off, he accuses the receiver." So imagine a situation where someone seems to be giving something as a sort of friend. Oh, here, I'll loan you this, or I'll give you this. But in the end, they really want something back. They don't really want to give a gift in a genuinely gratuitous way, but they're expecting a sort of return. Obviously, when the precise nature of the exchange is not based on any agreed terms, the situation can generate conflict. Someone gives something or does a service for another as for a friend, but he expects repayment and will fall to accusation if the other does not recompense him for the favor. Sometimes the motive seems to be generosity and thus indicates that the giving is in a gratuitous manner, but then the reality of the giver's intentions is made clear when he later expects some return and is offended when he is not recompensed. Aristotle next explains the reason why this happens. This happens because, because all or most people, though wishing what is noble, kala, deliberately choose what is beneficial to themselves. Now, to treat others well without seeking a return is noble, but to receive the services of another is beneficial. While it may make us feel slightly uncomfortable, I think we recognize the sort of reality of human nature in this kind of statement of Aristotle. There's often a tendency, we conceive something very well, and then in the end, we turn towards this sort of wanting something for ourselves out of a situation. There's a discrepancy between the way that people want to be perceived as acting. They want to be perceived as generous or as giving gratuitously, and the way that they wish others to act. So they want to be both seen as being gratuitous and receive something in return. Sometimes exchanges have an uncertain character simply due to the improvised manner in which they play out. Often circumstances can place us within such exchanges, regardless of our virtue or intentions. In the moment, one might intend to act with generosity, but then one later prefers to receive something for the benefit conferred. While it is unlikely that this change will occur on the part of the virtuous man, he could still be the recipient of generosity at the hand of a friendly acquaintance. Given these discrepancies found in human behavior, Aristotle proposes some guidelines for how the virtuous man should act in these situations. So, in ethics, we're trying to establish what the virtuous man should do, and we could be either the person giving or be the person receiving, which could put us in a difficult situation if we presume that someone is giving us something gratuitously and they really want a return. So if the receiver is able, he should return the equivalent of what he received and do so voluntarily. For no one should be made an unwilling friend. It would really be as if one made a mistake at the start and received a good from a person from whom he should not have received it. For he received the good not from a friend, nor from one whose action was for its own sake. Accordingly, he who has so received a service should dissolve the friendship as if it were made on specified terms, referring back to the other type, the legal type. And he should grant that, if he could, he would return the equivalent of the service rendered. For if he could not, neither would the giver have expected to receive it. So if he can, he should return the service. But a man should first consider carefully the person from whom he receives the service and the terms on which he does, so that with both these in mind, he may accept or decline it. So he wants the virtuous man to look and say, what's the context? Am I being given this thing or a service done in generosity, or is there something expected in return? Somehow in my mind, the image just came of the scene in A Man for All Seasons where the woman comes and gives him the cup and then starts talking about her legal gaze, right? It's clear that there's an exchange going on. And of course, being a virtuous man, he takes the first opportunity to give the cup away to someone else because he doesn't want to be seen to be taking a bribe. But a bribe is also this sort of thing where there's something expected in return. The advice of the philosopher is that one should try to voluntarily repay debts based on these uncertain terms of ethical friendship, as if they were agreements made with fixed terms, as is in the case of the legal friendship. This avoids the conflict where one might presume that the thing was given gratuitously, as if from a friend, and thus to try to make a friend out of a person who was intending to act for the sake of exchange. In the case where someone gives something that he knows cannot be repaid, then the return cannot be expected. Finally, one should consider who is rendering us a service and on what terms it is to be rendered. So this is the primary text that we wanted to look at. This is what Aquinas is relying on in his usage of the distinction between legal and moral due. But I want to continue a bit with Aristotle and consider the relationship between justice and friendship. Notice, in the end, if we're going to pay the person back in inequality, when it's uncertain, we sort of return to justice and the equality rather than this sort of friendship, generosity logic. And also, lest I forget, he talks about making a person an unwilling friend. We're talking about what he's considering these friends of utility. And obviously here, when he says an unwilling friend, that type of unwilling friend is leaning towards the gratuitous or the friendship of excellence. So, looking a bit at Aristotle and the question of friendship and the relationship with justice. Does anything distinguish the friendship of utility from a simple relationship of justice? Is it in fact necessary in these friendships that there be some further element which makes it a friendship rather than just a transaction of justice? Aristotle himself admits that friendship and justice have the same matter and involve the same persons. He says this is earlier on in the Nicomachean Ethics, I believe still in Book 8. Both friendship and what is just seem to be concerned with the same things and to belong to the same persons. For in every association there seems to be both something which is just and also a friendship. At least men address their fellow voyagers and fellow soldiers as friends also, and similarly with those in any of the other associations. Friendship goes as far as the members associate with each other, for what is just extends as far also. What is just too increases by nature along with friendship, since they depend on the same kind of things and extend equally to them. Whatever be the differences between justice and friendships, they come into play, this is me now, regarding the same things in the same persons. Whenever men interact in various human societies, which Aristotle is taking the sailors and soldiers as sort of types there, there is always the possibility of friendship and justice to enter to govern their association. With respect to the matter, friendship of utility has as its basis commercial exchange or services, and thus has a matter that is very closely related or the same as commutative justice. Considering the equality implied in these friendships, when there is doubt, as in the case of certain exchanges of moral friendship of utility, Aristotle's recommendation is to act as if the person was not a friend, in the gratuitous sense, and to render in return what is just for the favor or goods received. Part of the danger of these types of friendship is precisely the question of clarity of merit or debt. In both legal and moral friendship of utility, the necessary basis of the friendship is equality through exchange. While it can be claimed that all types of friendship involve goodwill for the friend, it is certainly a hierarchy in the types of friendship. Friendship of virtue is better because its matter, the good character of friends, is more stable and less apt to change and to lead to the destruction of the friendship. The other types generate their rapport and goodwill from less stable matter, pleasure, and utility, which can easily pass and lead to the dissolution of the friendship. In the equality of friends of virtue, a quantitative likeness is more important between the friends. But in that friendship, but in the friendship of utility, there is a need to maintain an equality of merit or debt, and this is shown by the virtuous approach to situations of confusion, when one should act by the demands of justice and not presume on the other's part a generosity proper to friendship of excellence. Aristotle proposes within his treatise on friendship a distinction between two types of friendship of utility. This distinction, seen in parallel with two types of just action, which we didn't look at, which is in Book 5, includes a moral and legal type. The moral type is one where the parameters of the exchange are not determined explicitly, and the retribution is left in the hands of the recipient of the goods or benefit. The legal type, on the other hand, is based on an explicit agreement which may or may not allow for some flexibility. These two types are introduced into the discussion of conflict within friendship. He introduces this idea of conflict immediately. Aristotle describes how the lack of a clear agreement between the parties in the moral type of friendship of utility is a cause for strife to arise within this type of friendship. This is due to the tendency to fall into self-interest and to not give what one ought to the other. The tendency is not checked by clarity as in the exchange, as in the legal type, and one is tempted to take the opportunity of the lack of agreement in the friendship to not render what is owed, due to the general tendency to act in self-interest. The tendency for arguments arising in this lowest form of friendship manifests the connection between friendship and justice. At the limit of these friendships of utility, so at the lowest level of friendship, the friendship's existence relies on the strict preservation of justice, which is endangered in the moral type of friendship of utility. But the exalted nature of the moral type is only problematic because it is misplaced in the friendship of utility. It belongs rather to the highest type of friendship, that of virtue or excellence, where friends render service to one another and generously, fulfilling what is just and more, and even more, without any need for contracts or agreements. The moral type, therefore, includes something inherently praiseworthy, which is misplaced when situated in a context of utility. Just a note, in the other ethics of Aristotle, which is less pertinent here because Aquinas didn't probably have access to it, there's a parallel passage, and he's much more condemnatory of this moral type. Basically, he says it's sort of inappropriate or erroneous. He's more openly critical, but he gives very similar advice about sort of rendering the due when the debt is not clear, as in the moral type. So, thus Aristotle, thus the text from the Ethics. And what I'd like to do now is to go back and look at a couple of texts from Aquinas where he starts to use this. And we're going to look first at the very first passage. So Aquinas is in Cologne for 2 or 3 years with Albert, maybe 4. He goes back to Paris and starts immediately working on his commentary on the sentences, a scriptum super sententias. And in this, when he first, in his first written work, deals with justice, he goes directly to this principle. So in view of time, I'm going to jump straight towards the text here without a lot of introduction to this context here. So the text is found in the third book on the sentences, distinction 33, question 3, article 4, questioncula 1, body. So if you think the Summa is complicated, you haven't looked at the Scriptum Supersententias. So he says this: in attempting to deal with the various virtues and parts of justice, there are also some virtues by which one renders to another what he owes him, not by the necessity of the law, but by a certain integrity, as the philosopher says in Ethics 8. For example, gratitude, which is a reciprocation for benefits received, according to Cicero, and also mercy and the like. And these virtues are a little bit more distant from true justice. So this certain integrity is this quadam honestate. So not by the necessity of the law, but by a certain integrity. Here he distinguishes between a rendering according to the necessity of the law and this quadam honestate, a certain integrity or nobility. He associates here with this integrity the virtues of gratitude and honesty, as he also does in the Summa Theologiae. So this very first text, Aquinas facing the very same question that he's going to face later in the Summa, and he goes to this very same idea and references this Ethics 8. He's just probably finished studying it in Cologne with Albert at this point. But this is a very different context than that in which Aristotle had employed it. But it does not fundamentally disagree with the idea of Aristotle. It is clear that the due of gratitude, for instance, is not something that one can exact from someone, though it is truly owed, but that it must be rendered freely by the recipient of some favor. In gratitude, there is no contract, implied or explicit, which is violated by a failure. Yet anyone who is raised well recognizes that thanks is a sort of duty, one that makes a person virtuous. Aquinas uses this idea again during the first period of his career in his Contra Impugnates. And there he attaches this debitum morale to something between pure gratuity and a sort of contractual obligation. So he says priests who have some kind of pastoral role, like a parish priest or a bishop, they work and they have an obligation to be supported by the people that they're working for. He says that's a sort of legal due. And on the other hand, he says the pauper, the poor person, has no right to be given alms, and so they're a gratuitous gift. But he says the preacher, he's trying to defend the Dominicans, the preacher has this sort of moral due. So something given in preaching and service, but without a proper pastoral office. And so he's saying he uses this again in the Contra Impugnates, in the sort of very difficult early years when there's riots and archers and people being killed in the streets in Paris. So I'm going to skip the actual text of Aquinas' commentary, except for one point, which I'd like to make. So Aquinas deals with this text of Aristotle that we just looked at in the Nicomachean Ethics. But he doesn't do a lot with it there, as you know from his commentary. Those of you who looked at it, it's generally a sort of explication of the text and a division of the text. It's not a very expansive commentary. But when he's talking in that passage about this distinction between the legal and moral type, he uses a phrase boni mores, so good character, good morals. And this phrase, boni mores, is often used in places where it has a sort of equivalence with honestas. So an idea which kind of encompasses the whole of virtue. So someone has good character, or someone has integrity or nobility of soul. So these ideas have a kind of parallel with slight differences of color and meaning. I believe that this boni mores is important in this particular case because in other passages, Aquinas makes it clear that boni mores are the things that make a person virtuous, but which are received culturally from your cultural reality. And there's many things in this realm of the debito morale that aren't precise and clear and are conditioned by cultural conditions. So not relative, but just when or how do you thank someone? When or how are you generous? When or how are you liberal or friendly? In what way are you friendly? These things vary greatly from culture to culture. They vary even from New England to California, I would say. Yeah, I was going to try to not make any California, New England jokes, but so there is this way in which, when you get to these finer points of ethics, the cultural context that you're in does matter. So it's not something that you can reduce to a kind of Cartesian or mathematic geometrical proportion of what is good and bad in this situation. That's why we have to learn from our elders. We have to learn from our parents and from those who are virtuous. We can't simply read a book and know in any situation what is virtuous. It just doesn't work because there's often individual contextual points that are important. So if you permit me, I will continue just for another few minutes and look at one particular virtue. And I'm jumping over another text, unfortunately, where Aquinas uses this idea of debitum morale in the context of charity. Question 23, Article 3. And in the end, you start to see that the notion of debitum morale is very closely tied to friendship. And there he ties it, I think, in a way where he equates it with friendship. So this sense of obligation, which arises in some sense from, not from an explicit do that something I have to do in an external way, the way that the legal binds me, right? That I owe someone money or I owe something this or that, but that one has a sense, a good moral sense, to make use it in a different way. Good character, an integrity of character that moves towards some virtuous action, towards gratitude, towards being generous, towards defending someone in vengeance, towards the truth, towards this integrity of saying and being what one is in an authentic way. So let's look very briefly at this virtue of friendliness, not friendship as charity, but friendliness, amicitia, which is in question 114, Article 2. Amicitia, discussed in the Secunda Secundae, question 114, Article 1, is a virtue which renders our exterior actions towards others in society fitting and decent. It is the fruit of a general attitude of friendship towards all those with whom we live in society. But notice I say an attitude. It's not friendship itself. We can't be friends with everyone. But it's a tendency towards friendship, towards all of those who are in our particular world, our own proportionate world of people that we relate to. It leads us to be pleasant towards those around us unless some good and necessary motive causes us to sadden them. Okay, so we can be friendly, but it doesn't mean in every moment we're never going to sadden anyone. We could have to announce that there's a fire in the building and everyone has to get out. And if we don't want to sadden people in that situation, there would be something wrong, right? Yeah. In the second article of the question, the relationship of the virtue of affability with justice is considered. In his response, Aquinas applies the notion of moral debt to tie affability to the principal virtue of justice. He says, this virtue is a part of justice, being annexed to it as to a principal virtue, because in common with justice, it is directed to another person, even as justice is. Yet it falls short of the notion of justice because it lacks the full aspect of debt, due, whereby one man is bound to another either by legal debt, which the law binds him to pay, or by some debt arising out of a favor received. For it regards merely a certain debt of equity, namely, that we behave pleasantly to those among whom we dwell, unless at times, for some reason, it be necessary to displease them for some good purpose. He's repeating what he said in the first article there. Living pleasantly with others involves a certain equity by which we make life pleasant in our society. This virtue would include things like saying good morning, taking care of personal hygiene, removing a hat when entering a building, being considerate when walking, and many other things too numerous to name. So like I said, it wouldn't be appropriate to stop to brush our teeth and before yelling fire in the hallway, because there's a hierarchy, right? At the same time, there are moments when it might be necessary to displease others. And sometimes, again, this is a situation where there's some problem, or there's some emergency, or we have to tell someone about something that's problematic or difficult. So I want to look at just one last section of this article. As we have said above, because man is a social animal, he owes his fellow man in equity the manifestation of truth, without which human society could not last. Now, as man could not live in society without truth, so likewise not without joy. Because as the philosopher says, no one could abide a day with the sad, nor with the joyless. Therefore, a certain natural equity obliges a man to live agreeably with his fellow men, unless some reason should oblige him to sadden them for their good. So we see there's something well beyond justice here, that we live in a way that is pleasant and makes the life of others pleasant and good. So this is sort of what I see as embodying the idea of this moral due, which really involves a sense of our own as to how we can make the life of others pleasant. I conclude briefly. The notion of debito morale is broad and is applied in different contexts, which render its meaning analogous. It is a relation that arises within the moral subject toward the object of virtuous action, as distinct from legal, objective debts like that which pertains to the special virtue of justice. It tends towards friendship, both in definition and in fact. Its measure is the noble or beautiful good, which can be extended to the whole of virtue. For apprehending well this limit, one needs the assistance of cultural wisdom handed down in custom and of the guidance of the morally wise. The virtues which render this noble due are signs of greater virtue and a more virtuous man, as they transcend what is merely required by the cardinal virtue of justice and are signs of a nobility, honestas, of character. Thus we can rightly call it a duty of integrity, a moral debt, a noble due. I believe that if we actively seek to develop our own sense of this noble due, we will become better than if we merely aim at justice in regard to our fellows. Seeking to fulfill this noble due in truth, in affability, in gratitude, in liberality, makes life better for everyone around us, and it prepares and increases the possibility of friendship. It carries us to fulfill the demands of justice, without which it would be in vain to cultivate these other virtues, and yet to go beyond in a way that moves us genuinely towards charity, the queen of the virtues. Thank you.